Tomorrow morning, walk into your kitchen and look around for 5 seconds. Then close your eyes and ask yourself, what exactly did you just see? You might remember the coffee maker, the refrigerator, maybe the window. But what was sitting beside the coffee maker? What was the color of the thing on the counter? Was the cabinet door completely closed? What sounds were in the room? You may be surprised by how much your brain quietly left out. And that's not because your memory is bad. It's because your brain is constantly deciding what deserves your attention. What can be automated? What can be ignored? And what explanation makes the most sense? The good news is that you can practice interrupting some of those shortcuts. If you want to become mentally sharper, you don't necessarily need to consume more information. You need to get better at remembering, questioning, and thinking beyond your brain's first answer. These 3 morning habits are designed around exactly those skills. Simple exercises you can try tomorrow without changing your entire routine. And stay with me because the third habit is the one I think most people could use immediately. Meet Priya, 31, lives in Birmingham, works in marketing, has a good brain, but it's been running on autopilot for years. She wakes up, goes through the motions, and somehow gets to the end of the day feeling like she's been thinking all day, but hasn't really thought about anything. Priya is sharp. She's just not using her sharpness intentionally. Her brain has learned to take shortcuts because shortcuts are efficient. But efficiency comes at a cost, and that cost is clarity. So let's start with the first habit. Habit 1. Reconstruct yesterday backward. Let's start with something that sounds almost too simple. Tomorrow morning, before you get caught up in the day, try to remember yesterday morning. But don't remember it normally. Go backward. What was the last thing you did before leaving the house? What happened immediately before that? And before that? Keep thinking backward until you reach the moment you woke up. Maybe you remember putting on your shoes, then grabbing your keys, then making coffee, then getting dressed, then checking your phone, then your alarm. But somewhere along the way, you may suddenly think, wait, what happened between those two things? And that's the part I want you to notice. Because a surprising amount of your morning can disappear into something that feels like memory, but is really a sequence of highly familiar behaviors. You do them so often that you don't need to consciously direct every step. You don't wake up thinking, okay, now I'm going to perform the highly complex motor sequence known as walking to the bathroom. You just do it. That's useful. Your brain has better things to spend its resources on. But there's a trade-off. When something becomes extremely familiar, you may experience it without forming a particularly detailed, consciously accessible memory of it. And this is where the backward reconstruction becomes interesting. You're forcing your brain to retrieve information rather than simply recognize it. That's an important distinction. If I ask you whether you remember what you had for breakfast yesterday, you might say, yeah, probably. But if I ask you to describe everything you did between waking up and leaving the house without looking at your phone, calendar, messages, or photos, suddenly the task gets harder. You're not being asked whether something looks familiar. You're being asked to pull it out of memory yourself. And that's exactly why retrieval practice is such an important concept in learning science. A substantial body of research has found that actively retrieving information can produce stronger long-term retention than simply studying or rereading it. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you that reconstructing your morning backward is some scientifically proven way to increase your IQ. It isn't. Think of it as a tiny cognitive workout. You're asking your brain to retrieve an ordinary experience, preserve its sequence, and mentally manipulate that sequence. And you can make this incredibly easy to try. Keep a small notepad next to your bed. Tomorrow morning, before your day gets busy, take it and write down everything you remember about yesterday morning. Backward. Don't check your calendar. Don't look at your texts. Don't use your photos as clues. Just see what your brain can produce on its own. And here's the part one really want you to pay attention to. Don't get frustrated when you hit a blank. That blank is information. Maybe you remember the coffee, but not making it. Maybe you remember getting into the car, but not finding your keys. Maybe you remember checking your phone, but can't remember what you actually looked at. You're discovering which parts of your experience your brain preserved clearly and which parts became background noise. And if you do this for a few mornings, something else becomes interesting. You may start noticing your mornings more while they're actually happening. Not because you're trying to memorize everything, but because your brain now knows you're going to ask it about the details later. That's one of the reasons I like this as a morning habit. It doesn't ask you to add another 20-minute activity to an already busy morning. It simply changes how you interact with your own memory. And there's a bigger lesson hiding inside it. Being mentally sharp isn't just about having a lot of information in your head. It's being able to access the information you already have. But memory is only one part of sharp thinking. Because even if you remember exactly what happened yesterday, you can still completely misunderstand why it happened. And that's where habit number 2 comes in. Habit 2. Find a second explanation. Let's say you sent your coworker a message yesterday. They didn't respond. Your brain probably didn't stop at, they didn't respond. It probably added something. They're ignoring me. Or they're annoyed with me. Or maybe I said something wrong. That's a very normal thing for the human brain to do. We don't just observe events, we interpret them. The problem is that we often forget where the observation ends and our interpretation begins. The observable fact might be they didn't respond. Everything after that is a hypothesis. Maybe your hypothesis is correct. Maybe they were annoyed. But maybe they were in a meeting. Maybe they missed the notification. Maybe they were dealing with something completely unrelated. Maybe they intended to respond and forgot. The interesting habit isn't always assume the positive. I don't want you walking around telling yourself that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. The habit is much more useful. Give your first explanation a competitor. Think about something that happened yesterday that bothered you. Write down your first explanation. Then ask, what else could explain this? Not a ridiculous alternative, a plausible one. That's important that if you can generate an alternative that is obviously nonsense, you haven't really challenged your thinking. You're just creating a straw man. Instead, make the second explanation strong enough that you would actually have to consider it. Let's say you had a meeting yesterday, and your manager seemed unusually quiet. Your first thought, they're unhappy with my work. Second possibility, they might have been dealing with something unrelated to me. You don't have to choose one. That's the point. You're practicing the ability to keep multiple explanations alive long enough to gather more evidence. This is closely related to cognitive flexibility, the ability to adjust or shift thinking when circumstances or information change. It's one of the reasons flexible thinking matters in everything from problem solving to everyday social situations. And there's a subtle benefit here that I think is easy to miss. When you practice generating a second explanation, you're creating a little space between an event and your reaction to the event. That's useful because your first interpretation can feel like a fact. It arrives quickly. It feels complete. And because it arrives so easily, your brain may stop searching. Think about how this plays out in real life. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Your brain, what an idiot. Someone walks past you at work without saying hello. They're being rude. Someone cancels dinner. They don't value the friendship. Maybe those interpretations are right, but you don't actually know yet. And when you mistake an interpretation for a fact, your next behavior is based on something that may never have been true. That's where mentally sharper thinking becomes useful in everyday life. You aren't trying to become detached or endlessly analytical. You're simply learning to recognize, this is what I think happened. It isn't necessarily what happened. Try this tomorrow morning. Take a notepad. On the front, write what I think happened. On the back, what else could explain it? You can use the same page for a situation that happened yesterday. And here's something I genuinely want you to test. Pick something you're very certain about. Not something neutral. Something that made you angry, embarrassed, disappointed, or suspicious. Write your explanation. Then make yourself construct the strongest reasonable alternative. You might feel resistance. That's okay. Actually, pay attention to that resistance. Because when you feel completely certain, your brain isn't simply processing information anymore. It's protecting a model of reality that already feels settled. And mental sharpness doesn't mean never settling on an answer. It means being able to recognize when your answer might deserve another look. There's another layer to this. Sometimes we don't even get as far as creating an explanation. Our brains make an even earlier decision. They decide what information deserves our attention in the first place. And that brings us to the third habit. Habit 3. Ask why until the answer changes. This one is probably the most practical. Let's say you wake up tomorrow and you're tired. You think, I need more sleep. Fair enough. But let's keep going. Why are you tired? I slept badly. Why? I woke up twice. Why? I was thinking about tomorrow's meeting. Why were you thinking about the meeting? Because I don't feel prepared. Now notice what just happened. You started with a problem that looked like sleep. But after asking a few questions, you found something much more actionable. You don't feel prepared. Maybe the solution isn't another productivity hack. Maybe you need 15 minutes to prepare for tomorrow's meeting before you go to bed. This is why I love the why habit. Because human beings are remarkably good at accepting the first explanation that sounds plausible. I'm procrastinating because I'm lazy. I'm stressed because I have too much work. I'm distracted because my phone is addictive. I'm behind because I don't have enough time. Sometimes those explanations are partly true, but they're often incomplete. And an incomplete explanation can produce a completely ineffective solution. Imagine telling someone they need better time management when their actual problem is that they're afraid to start a project because they don't know how to do it. More scheduling won't solve that. Or imagine telling someone you need more discipline when their real problem is that the task they're avoiding is poorly defined. Discipline isn't the missing piece. Clarity is. So tomorrow morning, take one problem that has been bothering you. Something real. Not something like, why is life difficult? Something specific. Maybe, why do I keep checking email? Then, because I'm afraid I'll miss something. Why are you afraid you'll miss something? Because I don't trust myself to remember to check later. Now we're getting somewhere. Maybe the solution isn't trying harder to resist email. Maybe the solution is creating a reliable time to check it. Or think about this. Why am I always late? Because I underestimate how long things take. Why? Because I start getting ready at the last possible minute. Why? Because I don't want to stop what I'm doing. Now you have a much more interesting problem. It's not simply bad time management. It's difficulty with transitions. That's something you can actually work with. And this is where your notepad can become useful. You don't need to write an essay. Just write, problem. Then, why number 1? Why number 2? Why number 3? And stop when the answer changes from a description into something you could potentially act on. That's the key. You're not trying to uncover some profound psychological truth every morning. You're trying to move from, this is happening, to, here's why I think it's happening, to, here's what might actually be causing it. That shift alone can change the quality of your decisions. And here's the important caveat. Don't assume the third answer is automatically the real answer. This isn't a magic 3 whys formula. Sometimes there are multiple causes. Sometimes your first explanation is correct. Sometimes you simply don't have enough information yet. The purpose of the exercise is to test your explanation, not manufacture certainty. That's actually what makes it useful. At this point, you might notice that these 3 habits look completely different. The first is about memory. The second is about interpreting situations. The third is about finding causes. But underneath them, they're training the same thing. Don't automatically accept the first version your brain gives you. With memory, the first version might be incomplete. With interpretation, it might be biased by your assumptions. With problem solving, it might stop at the most obvious cause. And your brain does this for a very good reason. Thinking takes effort. Your brain is constantly trying to make life more efficient. It uses shortcuts. It fills gaps. It predicts. It automates familiar sequences. It doesn't want you consciously analyzing every moment of your morning. And you don't want that either. Imagine having to consciously decide how to brush your teeth every day. So the goal isn't to eliminate automatic thinking. That would be ridiculous. The goal is to develop the ability to recognize, this is one of those moments when I should slow the process down. That's mental sharpness. It's not having a mind that never stops. It's having a mind that knows when to stop and look again. And before you try this tomorrow morning, there's one mistake I want you to avoid. Don't try all 3 tomorrow. You wake up motivated, grab a notepad, start reconstructing yesterday, analyze your emotions, question every interaction, and suddenly you've created a morning routine that requires more management than your actual life that don't do that. Pick one. If you want to strengthen your memory, start with the backward reconstruction. If you tend to make quick assumptions about people or situations, start with the second explanation. If you have a problem you've been trying to solve for weeks, start asking why until the answer changes. Give it 7 mornings. And don't measure success by asking, do I feel smarter? That's too vague. Instead, look for smaller signs. Did you remember something you normally forget? Did you catch yourself making an assumption? Did you realize the problem you were trying to solve wasn't actually the problem? Those are much more meaningful changes. So tomorrow morning, before the day gets noisy, try one small experiment. Remember yesterday backward. Or find another explanation. Or ask why until the answer changes. And if you forget everything else from this video, remember this. Your first thought is useful. Your first explanation can be useful. Your first answer can be useful. But none of them automatically deserve the final word. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is simply give your brain another second to look. Because a mentally sharp person isn't someone who thinks about everything. There's someone who knows when something deserves a second look. So which one will you try tomorrow morning? Pick one and see what happens.